Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this GHEX Research Committee's Spring Webinar Series, sponsored by the Global Home Education Exchange. As we wait for everyone to join us, please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are joining us from. Thank you. On behalf of the Global Home Education Exchange, I would like to welcome you to today's research webinar. I'm Dr. Deborah Bell, the chair of the Research Committee for GHEX. GHEX is an international NGO with the purpose to connect and equip policymakers, researchers, and organizational leaders who are interested in home education. GHEX was founded with the purpose of advancing the freedom to home educate. GHEX affirms home education as a human right, regardless of a person's motivation or methodology. We work with a diverse group of leaders from all regions of the world and are organized through our committees of action, as well as our 4 regional committees for Asia Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Albert Chang, Assistant Professor at the Department of Education Reform in the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas. He will introduce our presenter and take your questions following the presentation. Dr. Chang also serves as a GHEX Research Fellow. Our research fellows are accomplished academics with a scholarly body of research. They advise GHEX and are integral to our efforts to connect the academic community with the global home education movement. Our goal for our occasional research webinar series, like this one, is threefold. We want to bring to your attention new research that investigates or pertains to home education so that the information we share with the press and policymakers is current and accurate. Secondly, we want to connect the academic community with practitioners and home education leaders around the world to foster understanding and exchange of information. And thirdly, we want to provide a model for emerging scholars to emulate as they prepare their own research studies and scholarly presentations. Along those lines, I'm pleased to announce that planning for the next GHEX Global Conference is underway, and we will be announcing more details shortly. But we will provide, once again, monetary awards and travel stipends for the best original, unpublished research projects. So get started. We will issue a formal call for papers shortly. With that, Albert, I would like to turn the webinar over to you and thank you once again for your contribution to these efforts.
Thanks, Deborah. And let me add my good morning or good evening or good afternoon to everyone, depending on wherever you're watching from. And so today we have a real treat. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Duvall, who will be presenting some of his new work, investigating homeschooling counts during the pandemic. So I don't want to steal too much of his thunder, but he's got some really neat data, really interesting data that I'm sure will spark some discussion. So let me introduce Dr. Duvall for us. Dr. Duvall has served as the Director of Research at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in Percival, Virginia since August of 2020. After working as a public school psychologist for 21 years, during which he served students, parents, teachers, and administrators, Dr. Duvall spent the next 19 years as a university professor. And there he directed school psychology training programs. And it was during this time where he also served as a consultant for homeschooling families who had children with special needs. Dr. Duvall earned his PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Kansas and is currently licensed and certified as a school psychologist in 3 states. And so just a bit of housekeeping and ground rules before I turn it over to Dr. Duvall. I do want to point out to everybody that there is the Q&A button down below. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type in your question in the Q&A And at some point, we'll be able to have a larger discussion. You're also welcome to chat with your fellow participants in the chat window, but please do send questions into the Q&A discussion board. Make sure you click that particular button. Just a reminder too that this session is being recorded and will be available for future access. So thanks again for joining us. And with that, Dr. Duvall, I'll turn it to you.
Well, Dr. Chang, thank you. And I'll tell you what, I'd like also to extend my thanks to the Global Home Education Exchange for providing me with this opportunity to share information with our audience. And what I'd like to talk about today is the ongoing development of the Household Pulse Survey. It's one of the surveys conducted by the United States Census Bureau, and it's of interest in this forum because it provides a glimpse of how homeschooling is growing. I'm going to share my screen, or attempt to at this point in time, and see how we go. Share and start right here. And can you all see that without any trouble?
Yep.
Okay, very good. Okay. Just and real briefly, I want to provide this one particular slide. This is all the background we're going to get from a historical standpoint, just because it quickly kind of introduces you to the differences of how homeschooling has been measured in the past and how it's measured by the Household Pulse Survey. But during the 70s, homeschooling had almost become extinct. Probably less than 20,000 students were being homeschooled, and then it began to grow after some legal cases were won that allowed for religious exemptions. But then in the 80s, it grew to around 250,000 and as high as into the 2 millions during the early 2000s. And but I do want to talk about something very, very briefly as we get into this, and that is that there's an important thing to grasp about the different way that homeschooling is measured by the Household Pulse Survey, and in effect, it counts the number of households instead of students. So that's something very different that's been done in the past. And they consider a household a homeschooling household if it has, first of all, school-age kids in it, one of whom at least is being taught at home. And so, in a sense, it is a federal attempt, or let me put it this way: the homeschool or the Household Pulse Survey started out as a way that the U.S. Government was going to try to keep track of how the pandemic was affecting households across the country. And so it was developed as a rapid response, effort in a way to really kind of keep track of how the U.S. population was being impacted with regards to business closures, school closures, stay-at-home orders, the availability of consumer goods, and other very big changes that were going on immediately after the onset of the pandemic. But one of the things that I want to talk about is, or just real briefly to let you know, this particular project was not designed to study the homeschool population, but it just so happened that they included an item in the survey that allowed us to begin to measure the growth of the number of homeschool households. But one of the things that, because counting homeschool households was not initially a primary reason behind the development of this survey, it led to some overestimates during the 2020-2021 school year, as we'll see. But the later restructuring of the Household Pulse Survey has helped address this problem, as we'll see shortly. So it has been an unfolding effort. So It was started as a rapid response survey to measure, again, the impact that the pandemic was having on American households. And it's been run by the United States Census Bureau in coordination with 5 other federal agencies: the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Housing and Urban Development, National Center for Education Statistics, and then the National Center for Health Statistics. But again, it started in coordination with this many federal agencies back in March and April of 2020, but it has grown considerably. And for the last years, really since the summer of 2020, it has now, we've been including 16 agencies, 5 of which were the original ones, and then you can see the new ones that have been added. For a while, the Social Security Administration was also another participating agency, but they didn't stay involved for very long. They dropped out after just a few months. So you can see this has been of interest to many federal agencies in the U.S. government, as is indicated by how many now have an input in the types of questions that are asked. Now, because this was a rapid response survey, it didn't involve mailing out surveys, to be completed and then returned to the Census Bureau, as we typically think of as something that comes out of the Census Bureau. But it actually began as one that was sent out via email and also text messaging. And it started as a weekly survey back in April of 2020, converted to one that was biweekly just several months later, and then became monthly just recently in December of 2021. It'll continue to be administered till it is no longer needed, or until it is no longer funded by the federal government. This is a survey that is nationally representative of all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and then the 15 largest major metro areas. And so each time they conduct one of these particular surveys, they try to make the balance things so that it represents each one of these 66 entities as accurately as they can make it. And this is one I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on. This kind of gives you an idea of just how many surveys. Let me see, I need to drag something out of the way. Thank you. We've had 43 household pulse surveys to date. And, they continue to be labeled as week 41, week 42, week 43, and that type of thing. But they do that just for continuity purposes, because remember, this is a survey that has not been a weekly one since July of 2020. But they continue to call it a weekly survey, even though right now it's only offered on a monthly basis. But as you can see in this table, the phase number 1 involved 12 surveys back in the spring of 2020. And their sample frame for those weeks, they range from less than 1 million to almost 2 million. And what they would do is they would select these households that they were going to try to reach during that week, and then they would start sending out emails and text messages until they got a certain number of those responding. And so you can see that the average during that first phase was about 90,000, almost 91,000 a week, for the first 12 weeks of that survey. And they averaged almost 8% as far as the response rate is concerned. Phase 2 went to a biweekly survey, and now they kept, and ever since they started phase 2, they began keeping the sample frames about the same size, roughly a little bit over 1 million. But you can see the mean number of respondents during phase 2 was a little over 100,000, with the mean response rate being 9.3%. And then phase 3 involved 10 surveys, again on a biweekly basis. And you can see also about a little bit over 1 million in the sample frame size. About 73,000 was the average number of households that responded, and then for about 7% and so on. Now, the probably the biggest change that you'll notice is as you go down the list there, note the very last one, phase 3.4. That's where we are now. And as we walk through this, kind of keep this in mind, we've only had one in this last phase, and it involved, again, over a little bit more than 1 million households in the sample for that particular. Now, this is a month, it's a monthly survey, and they had 84,000 last month who responded for about 8%. But down at the bottom, you can see there's been about an average of 80,000 per responding households, per survey, and a response rate of about 7.31 was the percent average response rate. So let me see, move on here. Now, I want to kind of walk you through the questions that they've used over the life of this particular survey, because they do change a little bit. And for the first phase, this was where they were doing it weekly, and there were a dozen of these particular surveys where this specific question was asked. So it first started appearing in the end of April, about a month after the pandemic had began. And the question was at any time during February of 2020. So it's like at any time several months ago prior to the pandemic, were any children in this household enrolled public school, private school, or home, or were they homeschooled? And if you'll notice, so again, for the first 12 of these surveys, they keep asking whether they were homeschooling prior to the onset of the pandemic. So here was the result, or the results of asking that question 12 different times, over the course of 3 months. And so this is phase 1, and it started out at 5.4 and ended up, it looks like about 7% or so. But the average percent of households with school-age children that were saying they had at least one homeschool child at home was 6.7%. And as you look at this graph, I want you to note that the homeschool question was number 42 out of 50 questions. Okay, and the importance of that will kind of become obvious as we go along. So now we come to phase 2, and this started in August of 2020. So now we're about 4 or 5 months into the pandemic, the beginning of the next school year. And the Household Pulse Survey now words their question: at any time during this upcoming year, will any children in the household be enrolled in public school, private school, or homeschool setting? So, and now at this time, besides changing the time that the question probes about, this is when it became a biweekly survey for the first time. And again, the question remained number 42. And during this next phase, so early in the fall of 2020, this was the rate of homeschool households that were showing up in this household pulse survey. And for those of you who follow this, the pulse survey correctly or closely, I'm sorry, you'll notice there were two data points that were collected early on by the United States Census Bureau. The first one and the 16th data points. These two were discussed in a publication that was that appeared in March of 2021, and indicating that the homeschool households in the U.S. had doubled from 5.4% to 11.1%. I just point those out because as you read that article, or if you've read it in the past, you might wonder just how far into the process they were when they when they wrote that article. It's you can get to it here on this by clicking this particular web address, and I also listed the actual article, in the references at the end. Okay, now we move along into phase 3, and the question relating to homeschool in November 2020 on through March of 21. The same question continued to be used as showed up in phase 2. That is, at any time during the 2020-2021 school year. Did you have any basically school-age kids? Did you have them either in public or private school, or were they homeschool? Now, this is, okay, so I'm going to move on here. So this question being asked during phase 3 resulted in this particular outcome here. So now, again, the question remains 42 out of 50 items. And the mean during phase 3 was 13.5% of households in the U.S. With school-age kids had at least one child who was being homeschooled. Now, one more. This was the next phase. This is phase 3.1. And this took place between April 21 and July 21. And now recognize that what they're doing during the school year that started in the fall of 2020, how many children in this household were enrolled? So now for the first time, they began to ask for the number of children in your household that are enrolled in a public school, the number that are enrolled in a private school, and the number homeschooled. And they really specified that is not enrolled in a public or private school. So they began to ask for the number of school-age children in the house for the first time, and they separated the public and private school students into different parts of the response that a parent could make. And I do want you to know, when I heard they were going to begin asking this question, to me, this was pretty exciting, but I do want to tell you it was for naught, because they top-coded the number of children in homeschools that they would report at 2. So that prevented us from being able to really use it for a count. What that did help us with, though, is give us a way of to calculate the percent of households that at least had more than one child being taught at home. And that turned out to be about 43%. So we know that of the percent of households across the country that have a homeschool child in them, about 43% of those households have more than one child. So that's about all. The more it's helped us kind of keep track of the homeschool movement as far as the growth of it is concerned. So in phase 3.1, now this was at the very end of that school year. You can see what happened to the percent of households, it's begun to skyrocket with a mean of 18.6% during these 6 biweekly household pulse surveys. Now, this was the spring of 2021. And, how much do you think that these phase 3.1 estimates, alarm some educators? I would imagine this would mean 1 out of 5 households with school-age children now have at least one child in there that is being homeschooled. But anyway, in August of 2021, the household pulse survey, they began a recount. It's like there were so many children that had apparently been getting homeschooled in the previous spring that they decided they better make some adjustments to their survey to make sure that they were getting an accurate count. And so what they did, again, I've been saying that up to now, all of these questions have been asked of parents, and it was question number 42 out of 50. Well, remember that you're dealing with a rapid response survey, and can you imagine being on a telephone and trying to work your way through this list of questions? And our question about the one that's of interest to us didn't show up until number 42. Well, that was creating problems. So, probably the most important thing that they've done so far is they moved the question from slot 42 to slot 13. And it was very important because now this quote down at the bottom comes from someone there at the at the U.S. Census Bureau, because I called and asked about it because we were ending up with some very different results the first time. One of these questionnaires appeared, or we saw the results of it with the item now being 13, and it did change things considerably. Because up until this time, the fact that 1/3 of the participants had not answered question 42, it only made it possible for the U.S. Census Bureau to kind of extrapolate the findings to about 22 to 23 million U.S. households. That is the ones with school-age children. But by replacing it to the question and putting it in position 13, the number of respondents who would respond to the question, answer the question, greatly increased, and now they could extrapolate the findings out to the 32 to 33 million households, roughly that number of households that are known across the U.S. to have school-age children. So it did come up with some, more accurate findings, or it made it more likely that their extrapolations would be, they would generalize to the population in general. So you'll see that it's very possible now with the graphs that I show you that the first 33 household pulse surveys inflated the percent of homeschool households that can be seen in the following graphs, and all because they apparently repositioned the question. Now, here's the first question that appeared in slot 32. It says, during the school year that ended in the spring of 2021, how many children? So the question is the same, but it's just moved to a different place. And look what happened. So these occurred in phase 3.2. Now these are ones that took place, following up. These are the first ones that took place in slot 13. And let me say this: these were from the fall. So this is the start. Sorry, I almost skipped this slide too quickly. This is the beginning of a recount that the federal government has done since last August. They have continued to ask this question over and over again between last August and just this last February. Were you homeschooling last year? And apparently they were very alarmed that 1 in 5 households through the previous measures had come up as having at least one child who was homeschooled. They were pretty sure that it was an inflated estimate, and they were right. But for all of these that you see now in phase 3.2 were asked between this last fall semester and just recently, and they were actually aiming the question at saying, not are you homeschooling this year, but were you homeschooling last year? And over again, they came up with some pretty similar results, as you can see, kind of bounced around 10% and a little bit higher at times. And then finally, again, the one change that occurred here in 12/21 until it did become monthly. So, and when I go back here, phase 1 was weekly, phase 2, 3, 3.1, 3.2 have been biweekly, and now finally this one turned into a monthly. And then there is phase 3.4. This is one that just came out in March, and it is the first question that deals with this year. And as you can imagine, as I followed this all year long, I kept thinking that this is the question they would ask this year, but no, they kept asking about last year over and over again. And then finally, here in phase 3.4, our first monthly estimate of the percent of homeschool households in the U.S. is right at 10%. And so, for me, I was expecting, this is a surprise. I was expecting things to have dropped considerably, between last year and this year, and it doesn't look like it has dropped much at all. And again, this is the first monthly estimate that the Household Pulse Survey has provided. And the next one will come out. We'll see data come out that we can actually kind of manipulate in about 2 weeks. So we'll have a second estimate that comes out in the very near future. So all of this, again, involved a recount of last year. And then you can see those recounts were collected between 8/21 and then just like this most recent February. And then this is the first and only estimate that we've got for the current year. So basically, as this thing has unfolded, this Household Pulse Survey, and the one question that we kind of follow, you can see that it remains pretty stable. There hasn't been a big decrease really, or much of a decrease at all. We'll begin to get a better picture as the data from the upcoming months is reported. And so right here's a real quick recap over the different phases. You've got an estimated percent of households with school-aged children according to phase, and the mean was 6.7 in that first phase of household pulse surveys. And I just put likely inflated because, again, it was question number 42 out of 50, and they found out later on that had resulted in too many households, more than likely, being counted as homeschooling households. And then it didn't start to even out until they began their recount this last August. That would be phase 3.2, and it dropped from 18.6 on average to 11.1. The follow-up phase stayed very close to that. We had a mean there in phase 3.3 of 10.7, and then it's the most recent one, or the only one so far about this year, puts it right at 10%. Real quickly, I want to tell you some things about the diversification of the homeschool population. Now, we've got what I've been going through so far is just the progression of the measures that they've used, or the questions that the U.S. Census Bureau has used in this particular household pulse series of surveys. And again, there's only one question in that survey of 50 questions that deals with homeschooling, but it reports a way that we can kind of follow the movement itself. But now this, I do want you to know, this section here is brief, but at the same time, it kind of lets you know what was happening last year. I don't have this data made up for this most current survey, and I apologize for that. I just didn't quite have time to do that. But this, I want to report this to you real quickly. Between April of 2020 and October, the greatest change in homeschool households took place in the Black community, in which the percent of Black households increased from 3.3% in the spring to 16.6% in just 6 months' time. So you can see that there was a big increase in all of these groups here, but the largest was seen in the Black community. And more recent measures, so that was reported in that same article that had reflected fall 2020 numbers. These are spring 2021 numbers here that you can compare with. So from the spring of 2020, you can see what the percentages were, and then by the fall of 2020, they had jumped considerably, and then by the spring of 2021, so up until a year ago now they've jumped this much as far as the percentage of the different groups who are involved in homeschooling. So the factor increase for those who are Hispanic was a factor of almost 3, so 3 times higher. For the whites alone at the time is about 3.5. Black alone 5.5 times. Asian 3 times as much. Other race 3 times as much. So a very large increase, to the point to where, if you notice this column right here, the one that's highlighted, those are all pretty close, which indicates that proportionately, across these different groups, we are seeing households being represented as those who homeschool their children. So in the past, where a lot of times, especially if you go back 10, 12, 20 years or whatever, it was mostly you had mostly white families, evangelical families, who were homeschooling. It's become obviously much more diversified than it has been in the past. And so those estimates, indicate, you got a pretty equal proportion of the households in each group now involved in homeschooling. And so overall, I just want to conclude this with just a couple of comments. According to this survey, the percent of households with school-age children that have at least one child who's being taught at home has at the very least doubled. And just as importantly, the homeschool population has become much more diverse. And I want to explain one thing about that initial comment there at the top. The fact that I think they've at least doubled is, if you take a close look at that question, and let me see, I'm going to pull it up. I'm sorry here. I want to look at this very last question. But this is the one that basically has been same question, just a different date up top. But the reason I think that we are now underestimating the homeschool population with this question, is because a lot of homeschool families have an older child who they will perhaps continue to homeschool in most subjects, but they enroll them in a public or private school chemistry class or math class, that type of thing. So if you were in that situation and you looked at this question, what would you indicate? Yeah, most of the time I homeschool, but they're asking me if I homeschool and I don't enroll that child in a public or private school. So I might indicate, they're perhaps a public schooler or a private schooler. So I think this is probably confusing for many families, who have a child in that particular predicament. But in any stretch, I do believe we've got a homeschool population that is expanding rapidly, and that it's becoming much more diverse also. Okay, now you know what, I haven't had my chat window on, and I'll try to open that up so that I can see the questions. And Albert, I think I've gone through the material that I want to, and I'm available to respond to questions as.
Yeah, Steve, thanks. And this is really fascinating stuff. I think it's certainly getting my mind percolating with lots of questions of what's behind the numbers, and so this is excellent work. So yeah, there were some questions that came in through the chat, and so let me go through some of these.
Okay.
So one, you did allude to this a bit with the questions that asked for the number of students. I believe it's Maria Schwenk. So asked, doesn't the one household counted statistics undermine the accurate total number of homeschoolers in the U.S.? And so she is observing that in Austria, Europe, the government also appears to publish reduced numbers of homeschoolers, as they do not wish homeschooling to be a widely accepted alternative to the state school system. And I know you were emphasizing this as households, and so we are in some sense undercounting the number of school children. But do you have a sense for how big that gap is, or other comments about that? I know you said 43% of families have more than one kid.
And unfortunately, Dr. Cheng, that's all we know, that from this data. The other thing that you can get out of this is how many adults have made that decision to homeschool their children, but they still don't report the number of children. So it really isn't possible to accurately, deal with that particular question. You can just, it works out to where, like right now, you've got about 3.2 million households that have at least one homeschooler. Well, if 43% of them have more than one child, okay. But how many of them have 3 or 4 or 5? There is just no way of telling. Not based on the information that is gathered in this particular survey.
I guess you could try to, build some assumptions into it. Say if the average number of homeschool families with multiple kids is X, and
yes,
I suppose if it's the same in public schools, or would it be? But I don't know. I'd hesitate to go down that road.
I do too. And
parameters you'll have to assume.
Indeed, and I talked with people at the National Center for Education Statistics, and they have looked at this household pulse survey too, and they can't pull the number of homeschool children out of it either. It's just not possible with regards to the amount of information or the type of information that they share.
Yeah. Now, a clarifying question here. So Patty Marler is asking if it's the same households that are being surveyed each time, or are they different households?
They are different households. Now, I tell you what, at first, during that phase 1, during those first 12, sometimes they would drop off. They'd start with a new group for that week, and then during week 2, they would drop some of those people out and maintain others that they had not contacted during the first week of the survey. And then so they would do that during the first phase. But after that, they became completely separate samples each time, or sample frames each time they conducted a new survey.
Well, okay. So not only is it's just cross sections of the population, but they're even changing the pool from which they're
correct
sending an email this is what, email or phone you said? I forgot.
Either one.
Okay. So they're kind of changing the pool from of whom they contact each time.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it'd be neat to or insightful, I should say, to I don't know if there's some effort we can make to follow the same families longitudinally to see their decisions over time. But now, I guess if so, maybe let's maybe talk a bit about. I mean, there's some questions that came up related to thinking about perhaps the bias that may be in some of these numbers. Certainly I believe it was phase 2 where it shot up to 20%. The numbers are very big there, right? And I believe that the questions that were asking about what parents wanted to do in the fall.
You mean the first fall? Okay.
Yeah, that first fall. Now I noticed this too, that the language said, "Will you homeschool?" And so, how possible is it that is capturing intention but not actual homeschooling?
Well, and that would be an issue with that question, and also one, when you begin to think about it, with everybody having their kids home at the time, hey, I think my kid is homeschooling. They may be using stuff from the school materials and all that kind of stuff. They may even be doing things virtually, but they're at home. And so I think that there was probably that confusion. And that confusion probably didn't get cleared up until later, when they began to ask if your child is homeschooled, and then in parentheses, not enrolled in a public or private school. So I think that a lot of that initial data did have that as a real problem. And again, part of the problems with trying to follow this for measuring homeschools, again, and I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, it wasn't designed really to measure homeschools. It just happened to throw that question in there, and then they have improved it, over time. But no, it began with some issues, and it continues with some issues. But I think they're clarifying things a little bit more and more as time goes on. It has been an evolving effort, that's for sure. Yeah,
I mean, several folks in the chat have remarked on this. Homeschooling versus schooling at home, or remote learning, or I guess we have all sorts of terminology for this now.
Indeed.
Is there perhaps a way? So let's say someone wants to look in the data a bit more closely here. Are there other questions in the Pulse survey that might help us disentangle families who are homeschooling versus families who are just doing fully remote learning because their schools have closed?
You know what? To just real frankly, Dr. Chang, I don't think so. You can get in there. They've got various columns. The one I've been following that makes it the easiest to do calculations from, and I think it's called the terminology at the top of the column. This comes from the Household Pulse survey, the public use files, and it's kind of like homeschool check, public school check, and then private school check. Those 3 columns give you an indication of the households. You have to go to a different column to find out whether they have one child or more. But that's about the only thing I've been able to kind of pull out of this. And I'm mostly interested in the percent of homeschool households, just because I thought, hey, if I start trying to get away from that measure, I'm getting away from what little control that they've tried to exert over this particular question. I kind of hate to do that.
Yeah.
And another issue, they even suggest that we not even count households as much as we just say. I think I've been reminded twice by the people there at the U.S. Census Bureau to say percent of households with with school-age kids that have a child in that is being homeschooled. So they don't even think it's accurate to say the number as much as it is to say just the percent.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I mean, this is a question that just popped into my mind as you're explaining that. We often in homeschooling research try to count the number of homeschooled children.
Indeed.
But you're counting households. And actually earlier you said you made mention of counting adults who have chosen to homeschool their kids. What are your thoughts on which approach to take? Is there a particular advantage to either counting adults or households or children? What do we need here?
Well, Albert, I would just say we need to be consistent. And matter of fact, originally I kind of published a small article, and I was discussing adults, but who had chosen to homeschool their children, because that's one way that you can look at their data. But really, an adult represents a household. And, to me, it's just like I might as well go ahead, because it's going to be confusing to the reader to talk about, okay, how many adults are in that home? Is it a choice of one or two adults in that household who are deciding to do this? So I've just stuck with households, and you can do both. But unfortunately, they ask you, again, like you saw in the last couple of questions of the household pulse survey that show up as item number 13, they ask for the number of homeschool kids in that household, but they won't share it with you. Yeah. So we're just left to guess. Yeah. And supposedly the rationale is they deal with households. And they look at it as the percent of households with one, or the percent of households with more than one, or multiple children. So that's how they analyze their data, and that's why they don't report it supposedly in the individual numbers. Because I was really excited when I heard that they were going to report the numbers, and I was like, okay, there's not going to be very many that have maybe 8 or maybe 10 kids in that household. And to me, okay, that you could top code it though at 5 and not give anybody's identity away. But there's not going to be very many. When you start breaking this down, they have them by state as well.
Yeah.
Like you can read.
I mean, for the record, I think the National Household Education Survey, another U.S. Department of Education data set, you not only can you identify homeschoolers, you can identify the number of siblings and the household composition of the household, the composition of the household. And so I think there might be, if anyone out there wants to study household compositions of homeschool families, I think that's a data set that's available for doing that.
And I would agree. It's just that that's a different. I mean, they're more in depth about that. I mean, they're out to study the families themselves instead of just throw out one particular number. And I guess I have liked this because it just gives us a constant, up-to-date estimate of what's going on in the homeschool world, as opposed to the other one you have to wait every few years before they come out.
Yeah. Now, speaking of kind of up keeping the numbers up to date, a couple clarifying questions here. One, this started after the pandemic, and so there's no way we could make any inferences about homeschooling before the pandemic. Is that correct?
Well, again, the first dozen of the pulse surveys that were collected, those weekly ones that started way back in April. Remember, they kept asking parents, hey, before the pandemic, basically before it hit in March, were you homeschooling back in February? And they asked that through those first 12, from April all the way into July, that same question. So that kind of gave you a baseline from the perspective of the household pulse survey, at least.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those are the ones that came out as an average of, I think, 6.7% of the households. Yes.
Right. So there was 6 before, and then the most recent numbers are hovering around 10 or 11. So it's not quite doubling. And then we're also concerned about, who's homeschooling, who's doing remote learning, and that kind of thing as well.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And Albert, I would say in my mind, those initial, initial phases of this thing's overestimated, because of the positioning of the question, what that did to the results and that type of thing. And so now the most recent one of 10, that's probably an underestimate because, again, the way the question is asked, those original were probably overestimates because of just the structure of the survey. So
yeah,
I'd say we've at least doubled the population of homeschooling. But I personally, I believe it's probably more.
Yeah. Well, so let's think through that bias a bit more. I was struck when you said that 1/3 of the respondents didn't actually get to question 42.
That's right.
And so now, I don't know. I could tell a story of how that might be an underestimate. I don't think it is, because I think 20% seems kind of high. Right. So, in my mind, I was thinking, well, lots of homeschoolers, they don't want to do these kinds of surveys. And so maybe they start a bit and then they just, once a controversial question comes up, hang up the phone. And so are we actually losing homeschoolers by putting the homeschooling question towards the end? I don't know. It's just me speculating. I don't know if you have thoughts on the direction of the bias. I guess you would have, your assumption would be that homeschoolers are more likely to make it to the end of the survey, question 42, which would inflate it.
Apparently, that's what was going on. And they didn't know. They were guessing, and that's why they kind of restructured things, and they found some different results. When I think more of the population in general would complete at least question number 13 before they dropped off.
Yeah.
And then they found out with that there were more of that general population that were not homeschooling, and so that kind of drove the numbers down.
Yeah.
But I couldn't answer that question, Dr. Chang. But it's just kind of like, I think that was the assumption of the people at the U.S. Census Bureau.
Yeah. It's I think it's important, and we all have data issues with it, whatever we use, and so I think it's just important for all of us to think about. Well, okay, we know there might be some bias, and then we kind of have to try to post hoc rationalize or think through the bias. Speaking of bias, so Brian Ray is asked a question about the non-response rates. You had some non-response. Well, the response rates you had were about 7%. And I guess an anonymous friend of Dr. Ray is saying that, well, an anonymous friend at the Census Bureau would consider that kind of data not reliable. Do you have a response to that? A 7% response rate, what do we make of that?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. They do try to account for the non-response rates as best they can, and now there are a lot of tables, Dr. Chang, that don't come out until a later date, and they follow months behind. And I haven't kept up with those particular tables, and they continue to crunch the numbers on their findings and on these surveys, and then they report them at a much later time, and so I haven't been able to keep up with that, so I can't answer that accurately, but just know that they recognize it is a problem as well.
Yeah. And I assume they do the best they can with sampling weights to try to correct for some of that. I know that's usually standard practice at the Census Bureau and with the U.S. At the U.S. government level. So two other questions about the survey itself. So so Patty Marler first is asking, to clarify, the sample was from across the US, and that's correct, right?
Yes.
Okay. Is it possible, so she's asking, is it possible to extrapolate from particular areas of the country? And that way you might be able to identify particular areas that have more or fewer homeschooling families.
Well, you can get into state level data. And so if that's the question, if I understand the question, yes, you can go to that level. And you can go down to even get down to those 15 metro areas, because they're all sampled and they're all reported.
Well, so here's an interesting, I think I saw it was an article in the Wall Street Journal pointing to a study that just came out from the National Bureau of Education or Economic Research, kind of the first ever kind of cross-state comparison of what different pandemic policies did to a variety of outcomes, economic and social, et cetera. I suppose if someone wanted to tackle this, they could compare the different states, look at if there's variation in pandemic policy and homeschooling change in enrollment. I wonder if certain pandemic policies might have affected the decision to homeschool. So that's a free idea for someone that might want to try to tackle that. But anyway, the other question from Teresa Willen is, are you aware of any data sets and studies like this in other countries?
You know what, Dr. Cheng, I have not, looked at this kind of thing outside of the U.S. This was, I really felt basically fortunate to find out that this was being reported. And again, what has made it so interesting to me is it's been ongoing. And it is a quick response survey. And so we constantly get new data, and this will continue until they don't think they need it anymore. Yeah. And so I would strongly suggest that those who are interested, they get into those public use files, as you will. And there, like I said, there's 43 of them now, or 44, and they'll continue to come out on a monthly basis. So we'll have this that we can maybe look at and analyze. But I think it's been a very good effort, considering they collect so many, so much information about so many areas of life that I think we're fortunate that they threw this question in there. Yeah. And I'm glad, but I mean, since it is only one question in 50, there's just a limited amount that we can learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things I tell my grad students is, it's worth the effort and investment to get to know a survey, to get to know a data set. You never know if you dream up of a question in the future and all of a sudden you realize that a data set that you have become familiar with actually lets you answer that question. And so for those of you who are looking for research ideas or some tips, get to know the household pulse survey and perhaps know what questions are being asked, and who knows, one day you might have some kind of inspiration in the middle of the night that you realize you can actually answer that question with the pulse survey.
Indeed, and Dr. Cheng, I would encourage people who are interested in this particular survey to go to those public use files and access them, because they record every single response of every single household for every single survey that they conduct. So it is just a mountain of information that is available to them, for analyzing that type of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you the last word here as we wrap up. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Steve, for presenting some. First of all, the diligence and combing through 40-something waves of data and trying to dig into the question and the nature of the question, the phrasing, and then using that to try to map out, well, how many households actually are homeschooling, and how might those numbers be valid or not valid? I mean, this is all important work. Another thing I usually tell my grad students is sometimes the best research questions are actually very simple. And so I think this is an example of that. How many people are homeschooling in the pandemic? And you never know, if you have good data to cast some light on this, it becomes important work. So anyway, Steve, I'll give you the last word. Any final thoughts?
Well, I would just suggest, Albert, it's worth looking into, but there is so much of it to study and that type of thing that those who try to get a lot of information about the growth of homeschooling from this do need to be careful, because the question changes over time. And so they're going to end up with different results over time. And you can really tell that, as you get into that, what was it, the fifth stage or the fifth phase of this thing, where it just dropped off, probably dropped off because of the rephrasing of the question, not because there was such an enormous difference in the number of people that had been homeschooled. It's just that prior to that question being positioned differently, it's just like, hey, when they came up with the same question, pretty much, but just put it up toward the front, look what it did to the results. And that kind of tells you, even though the measure in that sense stayed pretty much the same, we saw some drastically different numbers, and they were talking about the same period of time. So I would just caution users to be careful as they get into that. But expect some surprises. But at the same time, it's a good data set. To just get it. It's an interesting data set to get into, and it's one that I think would, especially listeners in a forum like this, would be quite interested in.
Great. Thanks again, Steve, and thanks everyone for joining us. Just remind you that we have another webinar scheduled next month as well, so be on the lookout for that. Anyway, we, on behalf of everyone here at GHEX, I'll wish you a good day or a good afternoon or good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Chang.